Hi, besties. Welcome back, because today we are about to uncover something that has been hiding in plain sight for years. And once you hear it, you will never watch this family the same way again. What was once denied is now being admitted. What was brushed off is suddenly undeniable. And the truth changes everything. So before you click away, stay with me, because every minute of this story reveals another layer. And by the end, you will realize this was never just about favoritism. It was about power, visibility, and who was allowed to exist out loud. Hi, besties. Welcome back. Because today we need to slow down and really look at something that has been hiding in plain sight for a very long time. And the reason this matters is because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And suddenly, moments from earlier seasons that felt confusing or brushed off start to line up in a way that feels unsettling and intentional. And no, this is not coincidence. This is pattern. And a few seasons ago, there was a scene that many people watched without fully absorbing its weight. Christine sitting across from Robin, trying carefully, almost gently, to explain the idea of being a basement wife, and the reactions were immediate: confusion, disbelief, dismissal. Janelle looked genuinely puzzled, Mary seemed thrown off, and Robin shut it down with that familiar tone, saying she did not know what Christine was talking about, and wrapping it all in protection of the belief system itself, as if naming the experience would somehow threaten the entire structure. And at the time, that reaction was easy to accept, because the show had trained viewers to see Christine as emotional, as dramatic, as the one who felt things deeply, while the others appeared more grounded, more logical, more practical. But fast forward to recent episodes, and suddenly the story shifts. And when a story shifts this late in the game, it forces you to go back and reevaluate everything that came before. Because now, Christine is no longer sitting inside the family trying to be heard. She is sitting beside David, calm, steady, secure, and she says it plainly: "I used to be a basement wife." And this time, there is no confusion, no denial. Mary acknowledges it, Janelle acknowledges it, and then the narrative starts to soften. Well, maybe we were all basement wives at different times, or favorites at different points. And on the surface, that sounds fair, balanced, inclusive. But this is where the real distinction gets lost, because emotional neglect and structural diminishment are not the same thing. And pretending they're equal is how systems avoid accountability. And yes, each woman experienced emotional pain. Mary felt pushed aside early on, Janelle felt ignored, Christine felt overlooked. Cody himself admitted he gravitated toward whoever met his emotional needs in the moment. But structure matters, position matters, visibility matters. And when Mary stopped being the legal wife, everything changed. Not slowly, not subtly, but fundamentally. She did not just lose affection, she lost status, protection, and priority. And that is a different kind of loss, because legal wife status carries real power. The legal wife can stand beside her husband publicly, travel openly, make decisions without secrecy, present the marriage to the world without explanation. And once that status is gone, the wife becomes invisible in ways that are hard to articulate until you have lived it. And Christine articulates it clearly when she talks about the basement wife concept. She explains that it is not about where you live physically, but where you exist emotionally and symbolically. You are beneath another wife. You are not allowed in the main living space of the marriage. You are hidden, tucked away, so the public-facing relationship stays clean, uncomplicated, acceptable. And when Christine talks about Lehigh, she acknowledges that from the outside, it looked functional. Separate apartments, surrounded by other plural families, but the feeling was still there because the structure was still there. And this concept is not unique to her experience. Kristen Decker wrote about it too, describing how even as the legal wife, her sense of security shattered when she discovered her husband with another wife on her day, revealing how fragile favored positions truly are. And this is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because yes, roles can shift, Favorites can rotate, emotions can change, but pretending the structure was ever equal does not hold up when you strip away the soft language. What remains is power, access, and who gets chosen out loud. And when you look honestly, Christine parried more than her share. She did the cooking, the cleaning, the majority of the childcare. She became the emotional shock absorber, the peacemaker, the mediator, the one holding tension, holding everyone together. And that kind of responsibility drains a person slowly, quietly, until one day the only thing left is exhaustion and the desire for peace. Not revenge, not validation, just distance. And that's exactly what we're seeing now in her response to apologies. She is not angry, she is not rehashing, she is saying, please let me go. I have lived in the middle of everyone else's conflict for years, and that exhaustion speaks volumes, especially in communities like Lehigh, where the basement wife concept exists whether people want to name it or not. Some argue everyone takes a turn, but it doesn't land the same depending on position. And Christine herself has said hierarchy was never supposed to exist in their culture, but when it did, it was because people failed each other. And what is revealing now is how differently each woman responds when asked about it. Mary is direct. She does not minimize it. She calls it sad and admits it exists. Janelle acknowledges it, but quickly includes herself, saying she was a basement wife too, especially early on. And yes, as a second wife, she may have felt pushed aside briefly, but once Christine entered the family, the roles shifted dramatically. Janelle herself has admitted how much she relied on Christine to manage the household, care for the kids, organize the chaos. Christine even wrote that she often felt like Janelle's taskmaster, and that explains why years later, the idea of one house filled her with anxiety because she feared sliding back into that role, losing herself again. And when you look at their personalities, it makes sense. Christine is warm, relational, harmony-seeking, conflict avoidance, a classic people pleaser. Janelle is quieter but firm, assertive, direct. And for a people pleaser, that dynamic can become overwhelming. It's easy to disappear inside it. Then there's Robin, who says the basement wife dynamic is not condoned, and if it happens, people were not being cool. And that language feels painfully small compared to the weight of long-term imbalance. But the problem with that version is it avoids the truth. Because it did happen, and she benefited from it. If legal marriage did not matter, she would not have fought so hard for it. And once the adoption was complete, there was no practical reason to remain legally married unless it mattered publicly, socially, financially, and it did. And once she held that position, the family dynamic shifted. The money, the access, the priority, and she will likely never fully acknowledge the basement wife dynamic because she was never the basement wife. She may say she was early on, but the reality does not support it. She always had stability. She never lived the same struggle. And when she says it was not cool, she unintentionally admits that yes, it happened, and yes, it was wrong. And Mary's perspective adds another layer. Cody praised her openly, compared the others to her organization, her cleanliness, her structure, and those comparisons did not stop there. Later, he did the same with Robin, telling the others to be more like her. That is triangulation, positioning women against each other by highlighting what each lacks. And over time, it breeds insecurity, resentment, imbalance. Mary may never see herself as favored because that was not her emotional reality, but her legal status created a gap the others felt but could not name. And none of them can fully see from each other's vantage point because survival consumed their energy. And that is why Christine separating intent from impact mattered. She does not know if Mary meant harm. She does not know if Cody always acted intentionally, but the impact was real. And Mary recalls a time before Robin when affection rotated and there was no constant favorite. And that may be true, but favorite wife and legal wife are not the same thing, and that distinction changes everything. And even now, as pieces of truth are acknowledged, there is still reframing, still minimizing, still resistance, and the viewer is left watching the tension between what is said and what is avoided. And that tension is the heartbeat of this story. And it is why this conversation keeps looping back, because every answer opens another question. If the basement wife existed, if hierarchy existed, if legal status mattered, then how many choices were shaped by that imbalance? How many conflicts were never resolved because resolution required accountability? And how many apologies now feel late, not because they are insincere, but because the cost has already been paid? And this is why this story still holds people's attention, because it is not just about what happened, it is about what is still being processed. And as truths surface, the past has to be rewatched through a new lens. And suddenly, moments that once seemed small feel heavy, and moments that were dismissed feel revealing. And that is the power of finally naming what was once denied. What makes this second half even more unsettling is realizing that once the truth starts to surface, it refuses to stay contained, because every explanation opens the door to another realization. And that is exactly why this conversation keeps circling back on itself and pulling viewers deeper rather than offering closure. Because closure would require everyone to sit with discomfort they avoided for years. And that avoidance shaped how each woman survived inside the family and how they speak now. Christine no longer needs permission to name her experience, and that alone changes the entire dynamic, because for so long her role was to soften, smooth, reassure, and absorb. And once a person steps out of that role, the silence around them becomes loud. And that silence is where the truth echoes the strongest. When Christine talks about being a basement wife now, she is not asking anyone to agree, she is stating a fact rooted in lived experience. And that confidence is destabilizing to a system built on shared denial, because denial only works when everyone participates. And once one person steps out, the cracks spread. And you can see it in how the others respond. Mary meets it with directness, acknowledging the reality without embellishment or defense, because her position now allows honesty without fear. Janelle meets it with partial agreement, followed by inclusion, pulling herself into the narrative, which may be sincere, but also serves to dilute the weight of Christine's experience. And Robin meets it with minimization, reframing it as something that should not happen rather than something that did happen. Because acknowledging the reality would require acknowledging benefit and accountability, and that is the part that remains unsaid. And this difference in response reveals more than the words themselves, because it shows who has processed their role and who is still protecting it. And then there is Cody, whose influence lingers even when he is not speaking, because so much of this dynamic traces back to comparison and triangulation patterns that rewarded compliance and punished dissent for years. He set the tone by openly praising one wife while subtly criticizing another, by framing preferences as virtues and differences as flaws. And that kind of environment teaches people to compete quietly for approval while pretending harmony exists. And over time, that competition becomes internalized, shaping how each woman measures her worth. And when Robin entered the family, that dynamic intensified, not because she caused it, but because the structure rewarded her position, legal status, emotional focus, public validation. And those rewards shifting resources, attention, and power, whether anyone wanted to admit it or not. And once power shifts, it rarely moves quietly. It rearranges relationships, expectations, and identities. Christine became indispensable, yet disposable, needed but not prioritized, relied upon but not protected. And living in that contradiction creates a specific kind of fatigue, one that does not explode outward, but collapses inward, until the only escape is distance. And that is why her current calm feels so final, because it is not reactive, it is resolved. She is no longer trying to fix the system, she is stepping out of it. And this is where the audience feels the tension most sharply, because viewers were invited for years to believe in a version of plural family life that emphasized shared values, teamwork, and spiritual purpose. And now that version is being slowly dismantled, not through accusation, but through reflection. And reflection is harder to dismiss because it does not demand agreement. It simply presents experience and asks the listener to sit with it. And sitting with it is uncomfortable because it forces a re-watch of earlier seasons with new eyes. Moments that once felt mundane now feel loaded. Side comments carry weight. Jokes land differently. Scenes that seemed like normal conflict now read as evidence of imbalance. And that retrospective realization is what keeps people watching, because understanding feels incomplete, and the mind keeps looping back, searching for clarity. And then there is the revelation Christine confirms about being related to Cody, which adds another layer of complexity and underscores how small and intertwined the community was, how limited choices were, and how normalized these dynamics became through proximity, tradition, and expectation. And when you place that context alongside the basement wife concept, it reframes the whole scenario. Becomes clear that many of these roles were not chosen freely, but inherited through structure and culture. And that does not erase individual responsibility, but it does explain how patterns persisted unchecked. And the reason this matters now is because acknowledgement changes legacy. Christine leaving did not just change her life, it changed the story the family tells about itself, because her departure forced conversations that were avoided for decades. And those conversations are still unfolding, unevenly, imperfectly, but they are happening. And that alone shifts the narrative from idealized to human. And what remains unresolved is not whether harm occurred, but whether it will be fully owned, because partial truth still protects comfort, and full truth requires reckoning. And reckoning is hard when identity is built around belief. And so the suspense does not come from wondering what happened. We know what happened. It comes from watching who is willing to fully see it and who is still negotiating with the past. And that negotiation is visible in every careful word, every reframing, every pause. And as long as that tension exists, the story does not end. It circles, inviting viewers back again and again, not for drama, but for understanding. Because understanding feels just within reach, yet never complete. And that is why this chapter does not close neatly, because real life rarely does. And the most honest stories leave us sitting with questions rather than answers, and recognizing that sometimes naming the truth is not about changing the past, but about finally freeing yourself from carrying it alone.